Welcome back to Rethinking Politics. We're glad to have you guys here with us for episode 80. Of course, today we're going to be talking about Russia and Ukraine. I've already had several people I know ask me if we're going to be talking about Russia and Ukraine in our upcoming episode. And I told them, no, we're going to be talking about global warming. We've been putting global warming off. And today we finally decided
it's never seemed more pressing.
Let's break it down. Let's look at the stats. Let's look at, the numbers and everything. And we're going to help you guys figure this thing out. Seriously, though, we are going to talk about Russia and Ukraine. But before we do, I just wanted to have a couple of corrections and interesting notes. I mean, not a couple of corrections, a couple of things, including a correction. The correction is from our episode last week when we talked about Sandy Hook and the lawsuit against Remington. We were discussing frivolous lawsuits, and a lawsuit we brought up in that context was the McDonald's coffee case, which was Liebeck versus McDonald's restaurants, where a lady poured coffee on herself and sued McDonald's. Dan, you did end up qualifying that depending on how hot the coffee was, it may not have been frivolous. But in that context, we implied that it was frivolous. So we wanted to clarify, this was definitely not a frivolous lawsuit. Stella Liebeck, who was the 79-year-old plaintiff or victim, I'm confused about who sued who. No, she'd be the plaintiff. Ended up receiving third-degree burns that required her to be hospitalized for several days and took 2 years of medical treatment, including skin grafts, to deal with. I mean, third-degree burns are bad. Once you get third-degree burns, they don't just heal. The treatment becomes much more complicated. And
right. And it turns out it's like one of the most excruciating things you can experience.
Exactly. Well, and it's not just that, but it's in most cases it's permanent to some degree. The skin grafts means that skin was not going to heal. And on top of that, in the case, it turns out that McDonald's admitted that they had known for 10 years that at least 10 years that their coffee was too hot, and they had received, and there were cases in the past and there were evidence that there was something wrong and they didn't do anything about it. And so calling that a frivolous lawsuit is not accurate. It was definitely a legitimate lawsuit, and we just wanted to clarify that.
Right. You don't get to say, I told you it was a hot drink when it's roughly the temperature of molten lava.
Yeah, when it's
there's a scale of
when it's so hot that it's causing permanent physical bodily damage after 5 to 7 seconds, which is how hot the coffee is designed to be heated to at that time, which is 180 to 190 degrees.
Yes, Fahrenheit. That's neglect on the part of the company.
Absolutely.
Yes. So and warrants a lawsuit.
So wanted to clarify that. Also wanted to let you know that on Spotify, several of our episodes now have a little disclaimer where you can learn more about COVID-19. It's something that Spotify has added recently. I assume it's because of all of the Joe Rogan stuff that's been going on. This is Spotify's way of placating people, that now you can click on that link and learn more about COVID-19. So that's fantastic. That disclaimer is not fantastic. What's fantastic is that not only does Joe Rogan have them, but we have them too. And so I've never felt more special in my life. So congratulations that someone thought we were worth, if not censoring, then at least, clarifying, fact checking.
Yeah, something.
It's not exactly fact checking because it's not like they're going through our episode, but they're like, hey, here's the correct information if you were looking for it. So if anyone's looking for the correct information on COVID, feel free to go one of our COVID episodes and click on those links and get taken somewhere else.
We're doing what we can to get the correct information out there by providing content that can get flagged.
That can get flagged, exactly.
Click on the link.
It's the fastest way to correct information, so we do what we can. Oh.
Anything else?
I just want to say that we've talked about Russia quite recently, and I did not see this coming, Dan. We talked a lot about Russia posturing and how stuff like this has happened before, and we didn't think it was going to lead anywhere nearly as far. We definitely didn't think it was going to lead to a full-scale invasion. And to the point that I had a hard time believing it when I read the first the first few headlines, I honestly thought the media was blowing it out of proportion and that it was some kind of skirmish on the border until I read about the scope of what was happening, that I realized, no, this actually is a full-scale invasion, because I just did not see it coming. It deeply surprised me.
I'm still surprised by it, and I become increasingly surprised. There's a world in which, things change and certain facts on the ground adjust, other players become involved, things like that will make sense of it for me, that I will look back and I will say, I can see why they did this, and it made sense for them to do this in, not moral sense per se, but that they had a plan that was going to lead to a good place for them. As it is, I don't see that yet, but we'll get into that.
Before we get too far along, Dan, why don't you tell us where we are, what's happening? We're recording this on Wednesday, the 2nd of March, which hopefully we'll be releasing it tomorrow. So we're trying to stay as up to date as possible.
In the morning, here, which matters, because obviously with how things are changing and
a whole day's worth of events can happen.
Yes. Kiev at this point is not fallen, which is important because that will be the big news in the near future. It's extremely likely to fall. Russia has just got too much firepower, but it hasn't, and it should have fallen earlier, given the amount of firepower that Russia has. So that gives you some gauge of where we are. Obviously, once that changes, a lot of things will change. What's interesting, aside from what's happening in Ukraine, which we'll talk about in more detail, what's happening to Russia is worth noting. The Russian economy is going through. It's really bad. It's a really bad time to be investing in Russia or doing anything along those lines, which is to say the sanctions have been effective, and all of the other, and obviously within the level of sanctions being effective, there's a lot happening there. And I don't want that word to imply more than I want it to. By effective, I mean the sanctions are seriously hurting the Russian economy. The ruble fell 25 to 30% before, and could fall a lot further. It likely already is falling a lot further, right? Depending on which point you start.
Yeah, there's no reason for it to stop falling at this point.
Yes. Interest rates, because of the fall of the ruble, you're going to get the relative value of the ruble. You're going to get massive inflation, which they're experiencing. The Federal Reserve of Russia increased the interest rate from 9% to 20%. Again, probably not its final resting place, but that was the numbers that we found. And it's going to have to do more than that if it wants to stop inflation. There was a run on Russian banks as they saw that the sanctions were going to prevent people from...
Well, and I wouldn't say there's continuing to be.
Yes.
At least as of right now.
Yes, at this point, you probably can't get your money moved very far, if at all. But people were trying to convert their currency into their rubles into anything but rubles, is, I think, the official desire of the people. You invested in hard goods of any kind would be better, but obviously any business investment in Russia is going to be bad. Ideally, you get it into some other currency.
Which is why Russia has banned their citizens from doing that.
Yes, so Russia froze that too. All of these things have escalating effects. If the ruble looks bad and then people get out of the ruble gets worse. And so this is why the U.S. has this too, and would probably do this kind of thing too if the dollar ever fell very far. They probably wouldn't be able to, hopefully they wouldn't be able to go this far, and that our various legal protections would stop us. But things like the stock market was frozen.
Yeah, you didn't mention that. Yeah, Russia froze their stock market on Monday, and it's been closed since then, which is a long time.
Yes, the U.S. does this occasionally. If there's a change above a certain margin, you freeze it temporarily, because what you don't want is something goes wrong, a stock shifts. People react to the shift by leaving. It shifts further people. You get the spiraling effect. So there's that's at least the reasoning of why the federal, the SEC probably, or FTC, the Federal Trade Commission.
I mean, it's complicated because each of the stock exchanges are tied in with these other government agencies that have different policies and things. But yeah.
Yes. So they froze that, and all that's to say, various businesses that have factories and things in Russia are pulling out. In some of these cases, it's devastating. Russia, the way it was centrally planned so much of its economy, you would get towns with massive factories, and that is the thing the town does in a way that just doesn't happen in a market economy. And so you'll get like 500,000 people around this factory, and everybody works for this factory virtually. And then you have, the other things that keep a town running. But I guess you can relate to that to some degree in certain American towns. But some of those factories are going to be leaving, and Russia stopped that too. They wanted to prevent as many assets as possible and investments as possible from withdrawing from their economy in order to salvage what wealth they can. But their efforts are going to have, they'll be able to stop some of it, but in practice, the damage is done. Their economy is going to be devastated, already is, and will be for the foreseeable future. And it's even if everything stopped.
And it's worth noting that it's not just sanctions that are doing this. There are several factors that are taking place, and the sanctions, in many ways, one of their biggest influences was being a signal for everyone.
Yes.
To not just governments, but individual businesses are going out of their way to punish Russia. I mean, you have so many businesses withdrawing their business from Russia. You have Russian products that aren't selling. I mean, it's widespread and almost universal, this turn against Russia, which is much more than the sanctions. I mean, for example, one of Russia's largest imports is actually oil. It's fossil fuels. They're the third, I believe they're the third largest producer of oil in the world.
Yeah, they're second or third, depending on, I think, how you measure it.
And
in terms of exports.
And as people talk about
like
these things, talk about net importer and net exporter, it becomes very complicated because it's all about how you define it. We talk about gasoline, you talk about oil, you talk about all, petroleum products. It all becomes much more complicated. But in simple terms, it's one of the largest exporters, and none of the sanctions have targeted that yet. You know what I mean? The Western world is still accepting Russian oil on paper, and yet, even with that being the case, there have already been moves made by individual businesses to no longer deal with Russia when it comes to oil, and that's starting to have an effect as well, which is why the Western world has already worked to release, 60 million barrels of oil from reserves in order to offset that. Because why would you need to offset it if nothing was happening? Because technically there hasn't been a sanction, but even without that sanction, there is going to be a reduction in Russian oil sales just because of individual private companies that are making decisions. And it's actually really cool to see that all these people who are responding to a cause that they see as just, and, putting their money where their mouth is. I think it's quite cool.
Yeah. Individual stores pulling products from Russia, right? They're just grabbing something like, we're not going to sell this.
Yeah.
It's going to benefit people. It's going to benefit the Russians. And as such, we want to do people. And there's a real united wartime mentality here.
And individual companies that won't sell in Russia. I think it was Apple who said, we're not going to sell our products in Russia starting right now. And other countries are doing very similar things.
This is whatever else happens, Russia cannot gain more from taking Ukraine than they've already lost right now. Like if you just said this is over, everybody go back to business. Russia will not get, there's nothing in Ukraine they can get that's going to be worth more than economically than the damage that they're taking right now and what they've done to their name. This is why Brad and I looked at this and we were like, Russia's not going to invade Ukraine.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
And this right now is proof. Russia has not lost this war. If anything, they are winning this war, just not as quickly or as effectively as they should have, given their vast military superiority. But it doesn't change the fact that win or lose this war, they're going to lose, as you said, because the math doesn't add up.
The war wasn't that important in terms of what they're getting to their military and their government. Like the most of what drives the world is economics. And it used to be that you take a country in order to take their treasure and stuff. At least that was part of the pretext. In fact, a lot of what it was glory. It was the kings and their claims to title of other foreign lands and the way their families mixed together, and the European wars of old were mostly about glory, and it cost them stuff to get glory, and that was the exchange. This war is a disaster. And another crazy part about it is the Russians seem to know it. The Russian people. I wanted to point out, because we're talking about just the devastation of the Russian economy. The Russian people don't deserve this. At least as far as I can tell. They don't seem to be on board with this war. That's a very fair
statement.
They're
not
not
deserve this.
And they're frankly, it seems that they are surprised that Russia invaded Ukraine.
And Dan, you got to understand that Russia has almost entirely state-controlled media, and so the information Russians are getting on what's happening in Ukraine has been piecemeal. For actual information, because all of the official narratives
in terms of what they're doing there
have been propaganda and usually straight out lies. I mean,
yes.
And
I watched a documentary put out by the Russian government this morning on this. That was a lot of fun, where they were the U.S. is created this puppet government in Ukraine that is slaughtering Russian, that's committed all kinds of war atrocities against Russians in Ukraine, and the truly the ultimately Russian Ukrainian people that are there, and it's a very, some of that has little bits of accuracy. There were certainly things that you'd probably call war crimes that have happened in the Civil War there, and different things like that, but the propaganda is real for sure.
But what's interesting, Dan, is that in the 21st century, it's become so much more difficult to lie to an entire people. If you go and you look at I'm not sure if this is still the case, because I know Russia started cracking down on it, but for at least a while in the past few days, when you would go and look on Google at restaurants in Moscow, and you would look at photos and look at recent photos of that restaurant where people can show their food in the restaurant and stuff, you would see photos of Ukraine and the bombings that took place in Ukraine. And there would be, photos of text exchanges and information that was trying to be conveyed to the people of Russia through this unconventional means. Because once you have access to some form of the internet, there's so many different ways. That's just one example of the ways where information was getting through. And what's fascinating is, the Russian media machine started talking about the operatives of the U.S. government, the trained U.S. operatives who were planting this disinformation on all of these websites by, to try and confuse the Russian people, which is amazing because it's just average, ordinary people, the same people who take the time to update Google's information on Google Maps. I still don't know who these amazing people are, but these people with time on their hands and the willingness to go through and just slowly go through this piece by piece to add this information to those who can benefit from it. It's a crazy world that we're in. I saw a TikTok video of a U.S. military veteran who was posting videos on TikTok in English with Ukrainian captions describing how to set up a sniper ambush, not a sniper ambush, but a sniper position, and that he was trying to get out through TikTok to the people of Ukraine as just information for the defense, the territorial defense, because there's a large number of civilians in Ukraine who now have weapons and are tasked with defending their cities. And so he's like, what can I do to help? This is what I'm going to do. This is what I know. I'm going to try and get it to the people who can benefit from it. Just crazy things like that.
Thing.
Isn't that wild?
That is so cool.
I mean, this is something that cool. That didn't happen during World War II. During World War II, the Japanese and German people had no idea what was going on beyond what was being told to them by their government. I mean, there are stories of people who were able to listen to radio, to Radio Free Europe. It may not have been called that at the time because it was the precursor to it. But whatever the British radio was called during World War II, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember if it's not Radio Free Europe, because I'm thinking of the Cold War. But would listen to that and would try and print up news pamphlets that had information about what was actually going on, and they were often put to death because control of information was so important in Germany. And they used that control of information to control their people, and they were able to do it to a large degree, even though there were still gaps in that control. But today, it's just 1,000 times harder. There are so many more gaps that can be exploited, and that's demoralizing the Russian people. It's demoralizing the Russian troops, which is making everything that much more difficult for Putin, which is fantastic.
It is fantastic. It is absolutely a shame for the Russian people who, like I said, this doesn't seem to be their fault, and they're going to suffer immensely for it. And there isn't, if there were a way to handle this perfectly justly, right, it would not harm the innocent people. War is on such a scale that that's basically impossible. And so I hate war for that very reason. You can never limit it. It's at least extremely difficult, and in the broader scale, it's certainly impossible. Perhaps in an individual occurrence, right? Some individual engagement, you can limit things, and you can try to prevent collateral damage. You can try to, but even then, fighting the soldiers are. We talk about non-combatants, and you shouldn't kill innocent civilians. Some of the soldiers are just as innocent, right? They didn't sign up to go siege Ukrainian cities. Anyway, it's war is terrible.
Speaking of that, have you heard the story of the group of Russian soldiers who, as soon as they found out what they were supposed to be doing there, actually surrendered to Ukrainian forces?
No.
And they told them they thought they were there on, it was like a peacekeeping or training
mission.
drill exercise. And then all of a sudden their orders changed and they were told to actually start fighting. And they were like, whoa, we're not supposed to, we didn't come here to fight. And they actually surrendered because they didn't believe, like, it was just too much for them. I haven't verified
that's
it.
Awesome.
There are a lot of stories that are coming through right now.
True.
I should, as a grain of salt, as we're reporting, as things are happening, many of these individual facts could be wrong, and there's no time to verify it now. But things like that are definitely hopeful.
Almost certainly the anecdotes about particular occurrences, like I heard about an old man who's 80 years old who went and volunteered for the army there. They turned him down. They're turning volunteers for both the civilian side and the army side away because they lack the equipment and the leadership to actually deploy them and have them be useful. But he supposedly showed up with a briefcase with 2 shirts and 2 pairs of pants, and said, "I want to go defend Ukraine." And this whole there are other stories like that too, where the Ukrainians. We do know this much about the Ukrainian effort. It has been absolutely heroic in their efforts to fight off the Russian invasion. Even with the variety of problems Russia's had, you mentioned the morale. There's other organizational issues that I want to get into. Ukraine to have held so long has been just awesome. Just extremely moving. I get emotional talking about this war and the Ukrainians and the suffering Russians who didn't bring this upon themselves. Which brings us to the real question, right? The one that I think everybody's wondering or should be wondering. What on earth was Russia thinking? Why would you invade? And it's hard to tell who gets to call the shots. Obviously, Putin's in charge. And ultimately, Putin is responsible. I don't know how many other figures have the kind of power and signed on to this. I don't know the internal politics of Russia very well. Mm-hmm. But what were they thinking? The U.S. called it entirely. And I thought the U.S. was just, as Brad mentioned earlier, I did not think Russia would invade. I didn't think they would invade. I didn't think there was a chance in heck they invaded.
No, and
they did invade.
It turns out what the U.S. did was actually an intelligent
the U.S.
move.
Totally called it.
That they were using the knowledge that the U.S. government had.
It may have been critical.
Mm-hmm. As a tactical strategy.
The Yes, the reason what the U.S. did was absolutely in full credit to Biden and the U.S. military. They are extremely effective. The U.S. military is extremely effective at doing whatever it is they're going to do. Now, often their missions are terrible. Often what they're doing, I don't agree with. Often the counterintelligence stuff in the CIA coups and things are terrible, and we are rightfully skeptical. People should be rightfully skeptical of the U.S. military and what they're doing. When they said there's going to be a false flag attack, Russia is planning false flag attacks, and they're going to invade, that now makes sense. Because the only way that Russia keeps morale high and we've talked about how basically the world is united against them, with few exceptions. China abstained. It didn't support them. They have like 2 international supporters. India abstained, which is odd, but Syria and Iran are the only ones who were like, yeah, you should be in Ukraine. That universal disapproval, the universal condemnation, which has led to this absolute just devastation of their economy, is because it's very clear that they are invading Ukraine and Ukraine didn't deserve it. And that clarity would be lost if there was an effective false flag attack where Russia was able to paint the Ukrainians as doing something terrible to the citizens there that the international community should intervene in. If there had been an effective false flag attack, everything right now would be different. The way the world looks at it, the Russian economy, the defense of Ukraine, if they could have muddied the waters enough, the world would be in an extremely different place and Russia would be looking much, much better. And that's one of the reasons why you have misinformation campaigns, right? You don't need to prove it. You just need to make it look gray enough that people say, who knows? We're never really going to know what happened. And once you're at that point...
And that's what happened in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
It was clearly... I mean, looking back at it now, it was clearly a Russian act of aggression. But at the time, it was muddied up enough that no one did anything. No one really cared.
Yes, that we could say, well,
but not enough to do. There was not the response there was today.
No, the international response was, we don't know. And so what do you do? You had people with opinions and things, but the local players obviously care a lot. They're the people involved actually in the fighting, the conflict in their countries. But as far as the broader world goes, if it's too gray, people just shrug their shoulders and move on. The fact that it's not gray is what's devastated the Russian economy. And it's not gray in large part because of the U.S. And Ukraine did not appreciate the U.S. meddling. They said, what are you doing? You're going to make this happen. And perhaps there is a case to be made. We don't have enough to say this definitively at all, or even to do much more than speculate. Perhaps a case can be made that the invasion wouldn't have happened without these things. But it seems pretty clear now that the intent was to invade. And that there was a plan to make the invasion look much more defensive and to actually fit the propaganda that Russia is telling its people. But that propaganda did not get out in time, right? The whole initial engagement seems to have been really, really fumbled in terms of the level of propaganda and misinformation and in painting what this should look like to the rest of the world and to the Russian people. There's a number of other things that are interesting. The initial engagement, other sketchy things about the initial engagement that I think suggest more and more, or help us arrive at a picture of what the motivation may be. The Russian units that were there supposedly conducting training exercises, there's a lot of reason to think that is what they thought. The Russian soldiers thought they were conducting training exercises, and they were pulled from a variety of regiments. And so that they were not actually coherent units prepared to engage, who trained together and those kind of things.
Yeah.
And this matters a great deal when the invasion starts. Yeah, this really begins to matter in a war.
Buildup. I mean, when you think of when the U.S. has gone to war, especially when the U.S. has done well, it's because the troops went there to fight. I mean, it's something to be said for World War II.
He's a clear bad guy.
That when those troops went to fight, they were committed. You know what I mean? And when they're not committed, they often don't do as well. I mean, that could be argued as part of the problem with wars like Vietnam is you have, when you've got conscripted troops who aren't motivated, when the goals and the purposes are unclear and the people aren't behind you, it makes everything more difficult.
Yes. And while Russia will probably win this war in Ukraine, they are in for a world of hurt for the foreseeable future. Their actions have been so bad and so universally, seemingly clear internationally, that they are inspiring freedom fighters from other countries. You're getting people volunteering from places like Great Britain to go and join the Ukrainian army. Right? British citizens who are like, I'm going to go fight for Ukraine. That is a really, really bad sign. You get that in World War II. You get that in some of these other, like, clearly more black and white engagements. And Russia...
By the way, I want to clarify, it is probable that Russia will win, but it is far from a certain thing. You know what I mean? That how bogged down they've gotten is evidence of how incredibly well Ukraine is doing and how well the Ukrainians are fighting. And so at this point, at least it's my belief that anything could happen. Russia very well could win, or it could stagnate. And stagnation will quickly turn into a defeat for Russia, with how quickly the world and Russians themselves are turning against the government.
Yes, if they do not finish it soon, they will not finish it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's absolutely true.
And that's what Ukraine can hope for, because Ukraine doesn't need to beat the entire military might of Russia.
They just have to stall it.
If that's the case, then Russia will definitely win, but Ukraine just needs to hold on, and every day they can hold on makes Russia's position worse and their position better, because the entire Western world is trying to get equipment and supplies and weapons to the people of Ukraine, and it just takes time, and so every day they buy is making their position better.
Yeah, it's possible that Russia was buying their own propaganda. The Russian leaders, people like Putin, thinking that the Ukrainians would be much happier to, at least that a significant amount of the population really would side with Russia. And some of them have. Some of them see this as
or at least not
saw
side
this initially.
Against them.
Yes. As it is, the Ukrainian people have done the exact opposite. They've made it as clear as it's possible to make it that they do not want to be ruled by Russia in any form. And it's not clear what Russia's end game is here, if they would actually absorb Ukraine or if they would establish a new government in Ukraine and have it, give it the pretext of independence, give it the appearance of independence. But they, that's another way in which Russia may have miscalculated in a serious way. Because it's one thing to look at the Ukrainian army, which was not great, even though Ukraine has like 47 million people. Like it's a third of the size of Russia, but that's pretty big. It is not a small country. But it's another to fight against an arm when everyone's got a gun on every street corner. Making progress becomes extremely hard, as we learned in Afghanistan and other places, right? You can't, it's one thing to crush the military, hit the big buildings, destroy the bunkers and whatnot. And it's another to then make progress when you're getting shot at from every window. And that'd be the guerrilla element of it could really stall it out. And at that point, there's going to be an interesting place, or could be an interesting place, where Kiev falls, and then you get Russia trying to declare victory, but there still being massive amounts of resistance, trying to make it look like it's over, because they must also know that they're on the clock. And I just don't see how, I don't see how they close this out in a clean way, given the world has united against them in such a critical way. That's a good point. Maybe Ukraine wins. I think in the long run, Ukraine probably does win. I don't, and by long run, I mean over a series of years where they're just making it, where it's just a lot of trouble for Russia. But I don't know. It's
Yeah, there's a
it's
lot of
interesting.
variables.
Foreign policy is so hard. There's so much at play. The piecemeal regiments that I was mentioning, they should be able to make much faster progress through the fortifications and defensive positions of Ukraine. But they seem to be having issues, not just logistically, which I think people have heard about, where they don't have the fuel or the ammo they need at such and such a place. And so you've got vehicles that are just discarded or waiting on the side of the road and things like that. To take down a fortification, if with a superior force, you, obviously defenders have to some degree an advantage, so you have to make some kind of coordinated effort. And if the level of coordination, it's not happening smoothly, you get bogged down. You can still eventually overwhelm it, but you need the pieces to be in place at the right time. You need the artillery hitting as the flank comes in on the side, and repositions. And as this group moves forward and as this, the pieces need to be happening simultaneously. And that coordination is really, really hard. And it's in some ways the point of all the training. It's to be able to bring all these pieces to bear. And the fact that these groups have not trained together and are disparate groups who, with different ideas, it's been a mess. Thankfully for the Ukrainians, it's turned their heroic efforts into something fruitful, which then inspires more people. If you try really hard, you can have the bravest people in the world and they're getting outgunned by a really well maneuvered military. It's not going to, their courage just isn't going to matter that much, but it is here. It is here in part because of the failures of the Russian military to be able to really execute it well. They were also in bad positions going into it. They were in a position where they could invade, but it wasn't an ideal position, seemingly in part because they wanted it to look like something else. And so they went in from bad positions to try and coordinate something that they're unable to coordinate together very well, and the logistical support just isn't there. And then, as you said, the morale and the serious resistance, and it's the reverse of a land war of Asia. Usually we're talking about you don't invade Russia, right? They're the ones that.
But no, in this case, the land war in Asia is hurting Russia.
Yes. They're the victims of their own, what's traditionally been their benefit. Anyway, what do you see as the limits of this? The fear, obviously, in the West is that this escalates and that we end up in a nuclear war. That's worst case scenario.
Yeah, it's worst case scenario, and I think there's very little chance of that. There's obviously always going to be some chance of that. And the argument that Putin has completely lost his marbles is worst case scenario for that, because that makes him doing something like that much more likely. But I'm not sure that arguing that Putin is crazy is the right argument, because the reason he looks crazy is because his motivations are so foreign to us. But I think you hit the nail right on the head, Dan, when you talked about how historically nation states have gone to war, not just for material gains, but mostly for glory, mostly for non-material reasons. And I don't think this is very different from that. I think the Soviet Union fell in 1991 and we all moved on, but Russia didn't. You know what I mean? That Russia hasn't quite moved on from that. I mean, Belarus, who's an ally of Russia, still has strong ties with Russia that are very Soviet era-esque. As recently as 2013, Ukraine had a president who was publicly pro-Russia and was working to increase economic ties with Russia and decrease economic ties with Europe. So in many ways, you have Ukraine that's on the fence here between a modern Europe and a Russia that hasn't quite gotten past Soviet era ways of thinking, which is insane to me. Thinking of it that way is insane to me, but I think there's some truth to it.
In the leadership, yes.
In the leadership specifically.
The Russian younger generations seem more and more Western, in part because of access to the internet and things like that. But they're not the ones in power.
Yeah. And it's not a democracy really in any way, shape, or form, no matter what Russia may claim to be. And so there are some limitations to how the people feel about it. But
Yeah,
it's
tactically, it just seems like a big mistake. But as you were saying, it's interesting that one of Putin's heroes is Peter the Great, and that may not. In some ways, that's not that surprising, in that he was a very famous Russian leader. But he was a leader from the 1700s in fought in a major war, engagements with the Ottoman Empire and things, and it was a time where empire was the goal, where, this is the time when everyone, the great European countries are spreading. And that's the sign of your power and influence and things, as you colonize, you conquer, etc. And it was an age where the militaries were modernizing, and you were seeing new things and serious expansion from very powerful countries across a world where most of the world wasn't, right? Most of these are centered in Europe and spreading outward. And it's just interesting that he would, it is weird for me to imagine that someone still thinks like that, but he appears, that's one possible explanation, that he does think like that he's still in that mindset. And that as he's getting older, and as he's longing, or is, pro what the Soviet Union used to be, that he wants to return to some of that glory, some of that prestige and power that the Soviet Union used to have, which included having conquered these lands, having these lands as a part of them. Even though in this stage of the world, that's not as directly beneficial or as things as it used to be. I don't know. A man from another era is a way to think of it, and maybe to explain some of his motivations.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to think here is that this era is not as far away as us young people think it is.
Makes it sound long. Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like I'm 27 years old, so my distant past is conflict in the Middle East, but that's not even that old, and that's a time when people still believe they could gain things through military conflict. Naked land grabs, naked acts of aggression are not part of the distant past. But they're a part of the distant past when it comes to most of Western civilization. When it comes to Europe, it's part of the distant past. And I think that is part of what's made this one a little bit more unique. Like, yeah, this isn't the first conflict we've had since World War II. The U.S. has been engaged in several full-scale wars since World War II, and many other nations have been at war with many other nations in these past decades. But this is the first time that there's been a major conflict in Europe where one nation has just straight up invaded another basically since World War II. And that's what's made it so unique. And the fact, as you said, that Russia wasn't able to play it off as something different like they did 8 years ago when they did it in 2014. In 2014, they were able to convince Europe, or muddy it up enough, that this was not clearly just an invasion. And because they couldn't do that now, they broke an unspoken rule and caused it's not even an unspoken rule. All these members of the European Union, all these members of NATO, these are ironclad rules, but because of Ukraine's unique position, they were somewhat shielded from them. But it doesn't change the fact that this is violating a psychological barrier for people in Europe and these Western countries who believe that war is part of the past. And seeing Russia commit a naked act of aggression for no viable or legitimate defensive reason, who's going to be in favor of it? You know what I mean? This is just not acceptable anymore in this part of the world.
And the military buildup that it has inspired in Europe is interesting. We'll see how far it goes, but initially places like Germany are arming. They committed to. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, speaking of places like Germany, Germany is one of the countries that has broken a long-standing rule in order to send weapons to Ukraine. Normally, Germany's withheld itself from direct involvement like that. Switzerland has enacted sanctions against Russia. This is the same Switzerland that said they were going to be neutral during World War II. They're like, yeah, this isn't our fight. You know what I mean? The fight that everyone agreed was everyone's fight. Switzerland was like, nah, we're good. But they've come out of their neutrality for this one. I mean, it's crazy the kind of unified front we're seeing here that you haven't seen in a very long time.
Yes, it is. I've got to think that Putin's best play would have been, even if this was the plan, right, for him to invade and he was going to do these things, that at some point there, before he pulled the trigger, he should have said, if this is not going to look right. The optics of this are all wrong. And if we just back off, we can still pretend it was just a training thing. And the U.S. will look stupid. It'll look like they wanted war, right? It would have actually been to their advantage. They're calling for like false flag attacks and these other things. There was some really epic trolling from the U.S. foreign minister where they're cracking jokes about the U.S. invading all the time, or the U.S. predicting they would invade all the time. They should have just run with that.
Russia
backed
was
off,
jokes.
Rethought their life. Russia was poking fun at us, saying, if you could just give us a calendar of days that we're going to invade Ukraine, we'll know to take those days off in the future. It was really funny. Less funny after you invade, right? Now it's like, oh, okay. You're terrible human beings. And they could have walked away and had at least a moral victory over the U.S., right? And been like, they could have done their intimidation of Ukraine. Ukraine says no, NATO. They walk away. The U.S. looks stupid for having said they're going to invade. But they pulled the trigger and it's been disastrous.
No, and I have to think that Putin didn't think the reaction of Europe would be this strong. Simply for the fact that I didn't think Europe's reaction would be this strong.
Yeah. I didn't think they'd ever arm.
Even with it being this clearly an act of aggression, I didn't think the response would be this strong. And so I think the Russian government, especially those parts who were involved with this decision making, thought they would use a false flag attack that would muddy the waters. They would get Europe to mostly stand by the side, and they could basically topple the Ukrainian government and replace it with a puppet government without much fuss. Like, there'd be some sanctions and some ruffled feathers, but for the most part, they'd be able to get away with it.
And it would take just a couple days.
And it would take just a few days. And that would be part of why it would be successful, is because the whole thing, by the time people start getting upset, it's over. You know what I mean? If this, even with the false flag not working, if this had taken 3 days and it was all over, it might still have worked. You know what I mean?
That's true.
The sanctions coming in, but if you can wrap it up and say it's over, it's done. It's over. We're withdrawing troops. Ukraine's its own country again, even though now it's really not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
At least on paper.
In that world, a puppet government makes perfect sense. You pull troops out. You go, we're done with that. Nothing's happening.
Exactly. But all these things together, which like I said, we couldn't predict, many experts couldn't predict, and so all these things together have really ruined these plans. And so it makes sense. And so now, it makes sense in this crazy world. I should clarify. Makes sense is a strong term. And so
some of the pieces are lining up. Yeah.
And so now, with everything falling apart, I think in many ways it's just saving face. That if they can't at least win the battle on the ground, then it's just a disaster. The kind of disaster that can destabilize a government. That you launch an invasion, and not only does the whole world turn against us, but you can't even win a ground war in Ukraine against 10-1 odds, or with 10-1 odds.
If it did fail, it would be interesting to see what happens internally in Russia. Putin will be hard up to what is this extremely ordinary phrase I'm looking for? Hard pressed. It'd be difficult for Putin.
Almost
be difficult for Putin to keep his job. Obviously he rigs the elections and things, but even with that, he needs even a tyrant needs support. Even a dictator needs backing of powerful people and resources and things. And those people include, some of you may have heard about the Russian oligarchs that are kind of in the background of this whole thing. They're not going to be happy. They're already not happy, I imagine. And if this fails entirely, like it looks like it could, it's entirely possible that Putin ends up retiring or being retired.
Mm-hmm.
Which would be interesting. Be interesting to see a mix-up. A Russian mix-up of their replaced with somebody more temperate, more open to the West.
And that brings us to everyone else's motivations. We've talked about how this is a unique circumstance that's taking place in Europe. But more than that, most Western civilizations consider themselves modern, and not just modern. I mean, really, they consider themselves having evolved past war, right? I mean, you've got Europe that hasn't been involved in any major conflict within their own borders. Europe will send troops over, as part of NATO actions in different areas, but there hasn't been serious conflict close by in so long. And so we've considered ourselves beyond war in so many ways. And so war at this point, especially on Europe's borders, is something everyone can get behind, which has inspired governments to take extra steps. Why is Switzerland and Germany getting involved? Because at this point in the political climate that we live in today, politically, it's a home run. That no one is arguing against sending weapons to Ukraine. You know what I mean? Like Biden promises $350 million in weapons and supplies to Ukraine, and no one is bad mouthing that. You know what I mean? Like everyone, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, are on the same side. And part of it is the fact that at this point, no countries are sending troops in, which means even the anti-war people who don't want our troops to get involved, they're not upset either because our troops aren't getting involved. Like, you can have your cake and eat it too, because in terms of a government budget, $300 million or $350 million is nothing. You know what I mean? We send that kind of foreign aid on a regular basis to all sorts of random countries.
That's lunch for the congressman.
Sending $350 million in weapons and supplies to Ukraine costs us almost nothing, but gains us all sorts of political capital. And by us, I mean the current government. I mean, Biden changed the first 10 minutes of his State of the Union, because that 2 weeks ago it wasn't about this. The first 10 minutes of his State of the Union to talking about Ukraine. And I'm sure if you looked at graphs of how people responded to the speech, that those 10 minutes had the strongest universal approval of any portion of that speech.
I approved of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't listen to the whole speech. I did get through the war portion.
And how often do you approve of Biden?
This guy is doing good things. Who knew? He's a politician. You can see why war is, like you said, it's a home run for executive officers across the world.
I mean, a great example of that.
You need a good bad guy.
Is Trump? Trump made I would call it a clear mistake. Yes, you guys remember Trump of praising Putin.
If you haven't heard of him, he was president before Biden.
But he made the mistake of, I think it was Friday, or at least it became public Saturday, but of Friday, of claiming that Putin was smart after he invaded, and thus implying that the invasion was smart, and trying to instead badmouth Biden and the Western response. And you can see for the angle he's going for, he's trying to differentiate himself from Biden, trying to paint Biden as weak, something he's been doing for years. At least a couple years. But it immediately backfired because everyone is against Putin. And so even apparently siding yourself with Putin, even though you clarify that you don't think that, the invasion is just, but still claiming that he's smart when he's launched one of the dumbest naked acts of aggressions we've seen in decades, and arguing that that person is still smart right after they invaded, puts you in a very, very small minority in the world. And,
yes.
and it's the kind of mistake that very, very few political operatives are making. Because there's no reason to.
What do we say? Trump said something ridiculous. Fortunately, it's extremely ridiculous, and on an issue in which everything seems clear and clear with every day how ridiculous it was. And Biden just gave a speech, and it was decent. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Well, I'd say the first 10 minutes of the speech was decent.
Yeah, you mentioned that some of the contents later where he's resurrecting things that have died.
Yeah, I mean, at one point he was talking about initiatives as if they were new ideas that have already failed. Like he brought up the $15 minimum wage, and I was like, Biden, you do remember that you tried and you gave up. You said it wasn't worth it, and now you're bringing it up like you just thought of it. You know what? We need a $15 minimum wage. And everyone's like, yeah, forgetting the fact that you tried it, gave up, and talking about parts of the Build Back Better proposal as if Build Back Better is still alive when it's basically died. But
if you're about to apply some pressure to the senators, and you're going to get it.
But it's the State of the Union. It's a rah-rah, and especially when you start with that 10 minutes of wartime president,
of things where there's no
speeches.
Partisanship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's going to help him out. It's going to help him out in the polls at least a little bit.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if this international. I mean, obviously Republicans are talking about how bad he is and how every look he sends in Putin's direction is miscalculation and weak. That he's like he's this jellyfish of a man that with no spine at all, and all of that's a lot of political posturing. We'll see how it shakes out. There's an idea maybe we could end with that if I've heard a number of people say this, if Trump were president, this would have never happened. Is the claim. I'd be curious what you think of it, Brad. I think first off that that's impossible to say. And the reason that there are obvious reasons why you'd want to delay between what Putin did in 2014 with the taking of Crimea and things and this time here. You don't want those to be back to back because the point of it's critical that at the international level the water is muddy, as we've been talking about. There is enough confusion that you can say we're not exactly sure. We think Putin's an aggressor, maybe, but we're not positive. Now it is possible that Trump's presence would deter Putin to the degree that Trump is not a stable human being. And I would hesitate.
The most backhanded praise I've ever heard.
It is 100% backhanded. If you were a foreign dictator and you're like, we can provide enough cover in this operation that Europe's not going to interfere. But Trump may tweet at 3 a.m. that he's going to invade us. Right?
that the U.S. is going to war in Ukraine.
And so there is something to be said for the idea that even not at the level of like Trump is a strong man who's going to defend it, that you would wait. You would wait until he's gone because he's a wild card, because you're not sure what he would do. And that made a little sense to me. It's possible that had influence. We could play this
guessing game all day.
That's where we kick it around.
This is
what almost everybody does all day. If you listen to a talk show on the radio or something, they kick this around and they're like, "Oh yeah, Trump this, Biden's weak."
Because you could also argue that no, Putin would have actually thought that he could get away with his false flag attempt under Trump as well, and because he thought he was going to get away with it here, and that no one would do anything, and that because it backfired, and Trump was president, that it would have still happened, and that Trump would have had a strong response, and right now we'd be declaring war on Russia. And maybe not a nuclear war, but maybe we'd be in full-scale war with Russia over Ukraine. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
That's just as I would say reasonable. It's just another ridiculous possibility that definitely could have happened. You know what I mean? And,
Right.
And the variables when it comes to foreign policy is so hard to predict. I mean,
it is. And people say it like it's a sure thing. They say it with absolute. Republicans will say with absolute certainty.
It's a sure thing. No, for sure.
That Trump's would have deterred this because Trump is strong. I don't even know what that means in terms of like. It's odd. It's odd.
because you could even make another argument that Trump and Putin had an active and fairly amicable relationship. So as leaders of their countries, I'm not trying to insinuate something more than that, at least right now. But with that context, you could also argue that Putin would have pressured Trump not to do anything. You know what I mean? And that pressure counts for something. You know what I mean?
Yes, and that's what the Democratic pundits would argue.
Yeah, exactly.
Biden is the strong one here, yes.
And so I bring up these opposing arguments not because I think they're more likely than the other argument, but because I think these are all very realistic possibilities, and it's not clear-cut. And the reality is that it's happened, and that we're here, and that, yes, obviously it shouldn't have happened, but that's on Russia, and that's not on Ukraine.
Yes,
and that's not on the U.S. It's not on the Western nations. And surprisingly, how the Western nations have handled it has not been bad. I've been generally impressed.
Yes, and the egocentricity of everyone being like, this is America's fault, and America's to blame for this, and Biden's to blame, or that whole conversation is so tiresome, and it can be interesting at some level, the level of what might be probable, but it is raw speculation, and it's just not. I don't think it's a profitable conversation to have in which you would conclude something worth knowing and that was sure enough that you could base anything on, and it's just Anyway,
before we wrap up, so there's a lot that's going to happen. And we'll probably be covering this again in another week, and hopefully there's good news, but who knows? We're going to link a couple of podcast episodes that we found really helpful. If you're looking for more information, and some of it is stuff that we drew information from, particularly the Jordan Peterson episode where he talks to a Russia expert, Frederick Kagan, who has insights into Putin and some of the history there. So definitely look at some of those episodes. There's also some interesting data there that you can find, and then we'll follow up as soon as we can with whatever's happening.
Yeah, but likely by our next episode, whatever's going to happen will have happened. Whatever the long term, we'll have a much better idea of the long term.
With that, thank you for listening. This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.